Ugh, those are some long answer choices. That kind of scares me. But let's see. They just want the main idea. So let's read it, see what we can take out of it. Maybe we can get a dumb summary to start to help us sort through. Several scholars have argued that conditions in England in the late 9th through early 11th centuries, namely burgeoning literacy amid running conflicts between England's Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Danish invaders, were especially conducive to the production of the Old English epic poem Beowulf. Oh my God, the sentence is still going. And they have dated the poem's composition accordingly. Wow, okay. It is not inconceivable that Beowulf emerged from such a context, but privileging contextual fit over the linguistic evidence of an 8th or even 7th century composition requires a level of justification that thus far has not been presented. Okay, so my first thought is just as general advice on how to write things, don't ever write like this. People think that this kind of writing style makes you sound smart. It makes you sound like a moron. Whoever wrote this is purposely trying to be just a pedantic jerk. This is not normal English. So we have to sort through it. We can't, change the passage. But this is not good writing. Let's take a look at why, right? Because did you read that and understand what the person was saying? No. Good writing should be clear. This is not clear. So let's look at it again. So they've argued something. So it's from these times, and because of conditions, okay, they've dated the poem. So, okay, fine. It is not inconceivable that Beowulf emerged from such a context, but privileging contextual fit over the linguistic evidence of an 8th or even 7th century composition requires a level of justification that is... Okay, so basically my dumb summary is the date is maybe wrong, right? So they're not saying it's wrong, they're saying it might be wrong, right? They say at the start here, it is not inconceivable that it emerged from such a context, meaning it's possible, but they've got some problem with it. So let's just move on. I don't really, this is tough. A, although there are some grounds for believing that Beowulf was composed between the late 9th and early 11th centuries, so that's true, that's what they say, advocates for that view tend to rely on evidence that has been called into question by advocates for an earlier date. Okay, well, that has the right tone. Called into question means to say maybe it's wrong. So, okay, let's leave that. I don't know yet. B, although several scholars have dated Beowulf to the late 9th through early 11th centuries, others have argued that doing so privileges a controversial interpretation of the social conditions of the period. No. So, first of all, controversial, super negative here. But also, they're not saying in that last sentence that no, remember this part here. I'm going to use the highlighter. This part in highlighting is a really easy way to kind of acknowledge the other argument, but not necessarily say it's wrong, right? So they're kind of saying it's wrong, but they're saying it's still possible that the other people are right. Whereas choice B here is basically saying that the first grouping of people in this passage are just plain old wrong. They're interpreting history in a bad, controversial way. That's way too strong for what we read. This last sentence of this passage is very wishy-washy, saying they might be right, but they also might be wrong. Choice B is just like, no, your data is wrong, your viewpoint is wrong, you're putting this controversial idea out there and using that as your evidence, but that is not supported. So B is going too far. It's still worded in a tough way. It's how I get why you might not notice that it's way too strong. Let's look at C. Although Beowulf fits well with the historical context of England in the late 9th through early 11th centuries, it fits equally well, that stands out to me, with the historical context of England in the 7th and 8th centuries. Again, it's not saying they're equal. Equal is a word that really bothers me because it quantifies things. And we have to be nervous about those kind of words. This is about as quantifying as it gets, right? If two things are equal, they are the exact same, right? Now, they're definitely saying there's a possibility that the other people are right, but at no point is it like equal odds, 50-50, that both groups are right. So we have to be really careful of a word like equally. It means what it means, right? 5 is equal to 5. 5 is not equal to 6, right? Even though 6 is really close to 5, you would not use the word equal to describe 5 and 6. And so the same kind of thing is happening here. I know it's not math, but like you can't just say, oh, well, close enough. Equals means equals. Let's look at D. Hopefully we can get something here. Although the claim of a late 9th through early 11th century composition date for Beowulf has some plausibility, means it's possible. Advocates for the claim have not compellingly addressed evidence suggesting an earlier date. Okay, A and D are really, really similar choices. So this is going to be really tough. The first part of both seems right. And this is a really important strategy that for hardest questions you're going to need to do. You're going to get two, you probably have this happen to you all the time. You get two answers that are very similar and you just like, if they both feel right. Obviously, they're not both right. There must be a difference. So you have to kind of get good at kind of breaking the choice into pieces, figuring out which pieces are kind of the same, ignoring those, and then focusing on the ones that are different. So for me, the first part of both of these choices are the same. Choice A, although there are some grounds for believing that Beowulf was composed between these times, right? That's saying it's possible. Choice D, although the claim of a late 9th through early 11th century composition date for Beowulf have some plausibility, that's also saying it's possible, right? So they're both, that part is the same. So let's focus, let's use green here, on the second part. Right, this part and this part. There must be a difference here. Advocates for that view tend to rely on evidence that has been called into question by advocates for an earlier date. Okay. D, advocates for the claim have not compellingly addressed evidence suggesting an earlier date. So what's the difference? Oh, I spot it. Okay. Choice A is saying that the evidence is for viewpoint 1, right? So 1 and 2, right? I think we've established as a chronology here. So the evidence, right, the rely on evidence has been called in question, right? So this is saying the evidence that we're talking about is evidence of viewpoint 1. In D, advocates for the claim have not compellingly addressed evidence suggesting an earlier date, right? So the evidence now is evidence about 2. So now I have to think, okay, is the problem here that the evidence for 1 is bad or that the evidence for 2 hasn't been disproven? Right? Notice that's a different thing. It's so subtle, but this is the SAT at its best. It's really making us think about something. So let's go back. Let's look at that last sentence again, because this is where they kind of acknowledge there's a tension between the two views. So again, that first part is covered. It is not inconceivable that Beowulf emerged from such a context. That's saying the same thing as being plausible, being possible. Okay. But privileging contextual fit over the linguistic evidence of an 8th or even 7th century composition requires a level of justification that thus far has not been presented. So I'm really just focused on this. Linguistic evidence of an 8th or even 7th century composition. This is evidence of 2, right? The second viewpoint is that it wasn't made in the late 9th through early 11th centuries, that it was made earlier in the 8th or even 7th century. So the thing they're talking about is that there's evidence of that earlier time. So I hope you're following. This is such a mess. D is the answer I go with here, because that's also the one that has to deal with evidence of 2. And notice what it's saying. And the words are still tricky. Advocates for the claim have not compellingly addressed evidence suggesting an earlier date. Basically, that's what they're saying. Is the people for evidence for viewpoint 1 have their reasons, but that evidence isn't as good as the evidence for the earlier date. And so the end of this passage is kind of suggesting, hey, like, what's your reason for discounting this evidence that we have for our earlier date, right? You're just dismissing it, but you're not proving it wrong, right? That's what D is saying. That's what the passage is saying. Now, what choice A is saying, just to really give you as much information to go on as possible, is that the evidence that the viewpoint 1 people are using is not reliable, right? It has been called into question by the viewpoint 2 people. But notice, viewpoint 2 is not saying your evidence is bad. They're saying your evidence is possible, right? Your idea is good, but ours is better because we have stronger evidence. So it's very, very subtle, but it's provable. If this were me, on a test, obviously we can't spend, what are we at? Almost 10 minutes on this one question. That's crazy, but you would need to at least notice some little things. Hopefully you would get down to 2 choices like I did. And then remember, you can always mark the question for review. And so this is where part of the strategy is just know when to quit. There will be random questions that are harder than the others. Generally, it does go in order of difficulty, but in the passage questions, I feel like it's a little bit more variable. So you get a sense when you've done a good enough job, pick something so you don't leave it blank, and then move on and mark it for review. And that way, if you have time at the end, you can come back and really do the kind of deep dive that we did. But there are a lot of good points to get on other questions. We got grammar questions coming up, transition questions, those outlines we might have. So there's a lot of easy points that you don't want to run out of time for. So hopefully all of this made sense, but it might be more than you're capable of doing on test day. So it's okay. There's always gonna be one or two that are really, really tough. Just accept it and you can still get a great score even if you get these one or two wrong. But if you got down to 50-50, hey, you still got a 50% chance of getting it right just by guessing. That's better than nothing.